Imagine standing before a door you have been walking towards for 3 chapters. Behind you, the watchtowers of the Jade Gate Pass, where silver-haired soldiers held the line for 42 years, their eyes fixed east on a home they would never reach. Behind you, the painted caves of Mogao, where a hero's procession marches forever across the wall. A man who liberated 11 prefectures and died in Chang'an, looking up at the moon. Behind you, the desert heat and the mountain snow. And ahead of you, nothing but answers. Answers that may not be what you had hoped for, because somewhere in this long dream of everything the Tang Dynasty was supposed to mean, there is a truth that had waited 3 chapters to speak. What if the home you had been walking towards your whole life was already dead before you began walking? What if the dynasty that sent its soldiers to the frontier, that abandoned its people to the Tibetans, that kept its heroes in gilded cages, what if it was never coming back? Would you still walk east? Would you still call it home? On April 30th, the final chapter of Heshi arrives, Qinchuan. The boundless grasslands, the 4 seasons shifting under the same sky, the last unanswered questions of a dream that has carried us from the sands of Yumen Pass to the snows of Liangzhou. As always, this video has no spoilers and provides only the relevant historical context of the time. But this video is a bit different from the others, because for the first time in this journey, the history is not the map. It is the shadow behind the map. The storylines of Qinchuan will be about you, young master, about the truth of your origin that has been waiting beneath the surface of every side quest, every forgotten letter, every ghost who whispers of their longing to come home. Whispers that were meant only for your ears all along. So here is my promise. You do not need to watch this video to understand what happens in Qinchuan. The game will tell you its own story in its own way, and that will be enough. But if you choose to stay and walk with me a little longer, I will give you something else. The taste of smoke over a city that should have never burnt. The weight of a river that ran red with the bodies of men who thought they were serving the dynasty that killed them. You have spent the last 2 chapters walking towards the moon that hangs over Chang'an, the city that you've heard every soul speak of with warmth and reverence, a home that seemingly everyone you've met in the dream was trying to reach. The history I will tell you today will explain why reaching that home was never possible. So welcome back, young master. This is the last door. I will not tell you what is on the other side, but I will tell you how we got here. Let us begin where the dream begins to break. Qinchuan is a lost fortress, its ruins submerged beneath a sunken lake. It was once the vibrant gateway to Chang'an, the last stop before the capital, the place where travelers from the western regions paused before the final stretch of their journey home. But something happened here. Something that sent it crashing into the abyss, its story buried underneath fire and water. The land around the Wei River and the Qinling Mountains connected the Heshi corridor to the Guanzhong Plain, the heartland of the Tang Dynasty. Through this land passed everything the empire had imported for 3 centuries: soldiers returning from the frontier, merchants from Samarkand, news from the outside world. But by the late 9th century, the road through Qinchuan had transformed from being a lifeline to becoming a bleeding wound. The dynasty that had once stretched from Korea to Central Asia had been slowly dying for decades. By the time Zhang Yichao was laying maps before Emperor Xuanzong, the Tang had already lost control of its own borders. The Anlushan rebellion had shattered the empire's military system, leaving behind a patchwork of warlords, military governors called jiadusha, who ruled their territories as their own kingdoms. They collected their own taxes, raised their own armies, and passed their power to their sons. The emperor in Chang'an was a ghost in his own palace, tolerated by the warlords only as a source of legitimacy and stripped of any real authority. The court was paralyzed. The treasury was empty. The imperial guards, the very soldiers who were supposed to protect the throne, had been wiped out in the chaos. All that remained of the dynasty's power was a name. A name that still carried weight, still compelled loyalty, still made men weep when they heard stories of what the Tang had once been. But a name is not an army. A name cannot hold a frontier. And now, a new warlord was rising in the east. His name was Zhu Wen. His origins were humble. He was a general serving under a rebel commonly thought of as the leader who would one day tear the dynasty down. But then, at a critical battle, he surrendered to the imperial side. Rather than executing him, the desperate Tang court saw the value of having him as a commander and welcomed him into their fold. The emperor even gave him a new name, Zhu Chuanzhong, meaning all loyalty, a gift meant to bind him to the dynasty. It was a name that would prove to be one of the cruelest ironies of the age. Zhu Wen was a survivor. He had no reverence for the emperor, no nostalgia for the golden age, and no patience for the rituals and courtesies that had sustained the Tang for nearly 3 centuries. He had seen what loyalty bought for others, a room in a gilded cage, and he had no intention of letting that happen to him. Behind him lay Qingchuan, the gateway to Chang'an. Ahead of him lay the capital itself. But between the two, something had to die. In the spring of 904, Zhu Wen looked at Chang'an and saw not the glory of a dynasty, but the staging ground for his own ambitions. Emperor Zhaozong had been a puppet for years, but he was a puppet who still breathed. Zhu Wen decided to solve that problem permanently. That year, he murdered Emperor Zhaozong and most of his family. He then placed Zhaozong's 13-year-old son on the throne as a puppet, a boy titled Emperor Ai, a boy who would never rule. The last emperor of the Tang, a child who watched his father's killers smile at him from across the court, knowing that every morning he woke up was a very, very fragile gift. But a puppet emperor needed a puppet capital. The old capital, Chang'an, had been the seat of power for nearly 300 years. Its walls held too much history, too much memory. In the same year, Zhu Wen ordered the forced relocation of the entire court to the eastern city of Luoyang. The movement was not by invitation or negotiation. It was by fire and command. Zhaozong's son, the new young Emperor Ai, was marched east at the head of a column of hostages. Behind him, the people of Chang'an followed, herded like cattle, stripped of their homes, their livelihoods, their history. Families who had lived in the capital for generations watched it fall silent behind them as they were forced to walk away. And yet worse followed. In Luoyang, the emperor was a prisoner. The palace, once the site of great councils, was now the site of public humiliations. By 907, the pretense of governance had become impossible to maintain. Zhu Wen forced the abdication of the child emperor, proclaiming himself the founding emperor of a new, later Liang dynasty. The Tang, which had begun in 618, was no more. But he did not stop at the throne. In 908, to eliminate any possible future claimant, Zhu Wen ordered the former boy emperor poisoned. He was only 17. The man who had been named Zhu Chuanzhang, all loyalty, murdered the last of the Li dynasty in cold blood, leaving the title of Emperor Ai of Tang as a final, hollow eulogy. Ai meant sorrow, and he would be the last legitimate emperor of Tang in history. But here is a moment where the game deliberately deviates from historical records. Emperor Ai, in Werwen's Meat, yet lives, lurking in the shadows of a powerful organization. He is even recorded in your character journal as the last emperor, if you wish to go and check who it is. But for now, let's continue with history. The year was 905, and Zhu Wen had a problem. Not the child puppet on the throne. The problem was the men around the throne, the ministers and officials who still believed in the name of the dynasty, the men whose loyalty to the Tang was the only thing keeping its memory alive. In Zhu Wen's eyes, they had to go. They were a threat not because they had armies, because they had none. They were a threat because they had legitimacy. The scheme was cynical. First, he agreed to a series of decrees exiling these men from court. Then, once they were scattered and vulnerable, he changed his mind. He gathered them at a remote courier station called White Horse, Bai Ma, far from any city, from any witnesses. 30 of them, among them the finest minds of the generation, men who had passed the imperial examinations and served the dynasty for decades. They were deeply loyal men, whose only crime was that they stood in the way of a usurper's ambition. All 30 of them were slaughtered on the same night by forced suicide, and their bodies were thrown directly into the waters of the Yellow River. It was a calculated humiliation, designed not just to kill, but to defile. The man who whispered the suggestion into Zhu Wen's ear was named Li Zhen. He had tried for many years to pass the imperial examinations that the murdered ministers had passed with ease. He had failed again and again, and his failure had curdled into a deep resentment, hatred of the scholars, of the system, of everyone who strutted in the halls of power while he scraped at its edges and could not enter. When he finally rose to power behind Zhu Wen, he made sure that the men who had once looked down on him would look down on no one ever again. His words, as the bodies splashed into the Yellow River, are said to have been, "These men called themselves the clear stream. Let them now be tossed into the Yellow River, where they may forever become the turbid current." It was a calculated insult, a man's lifelong bitterness poured into the ear of a killer, and a signal that the old world of cultured governance was over. The massacre at Baima Station did not kill the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty had been dying for decades, bleeding out under the weight of its own failures. But what the massacre did was remove the last obstacles to the inevitable. With the ministers gone, with the scholars silenced, with the court reduced to a collection of puppets, there was now nothing left to oppose Zhu Wen's brutal ambition. 2 years later, in 907, the final act was written. A forced abdication, a poisoned child, and a dynasty's 3-century rule turned to ash. The official collapse of the Tang dynasty is marked in the year 907, which is the start of the infamous period in Chinese history known as the Five Dynasties and Tang Kingdom period that lasted 53 years. An era of warlord rule, constant bloodshed, and political upheaval. The era that was still happening when you were born, young master. When Uncle Jiang carried you on horseback while escaping from bandits. that chaotic era was still over a decade away from being over. In the present time, in the Qinghe and Kaifeng that you are used to, young master, it has only been 2 years since that chaotic era ended. Only 2 years since the establishment of the great Song dynasty by the magnificent Emperor Zhao. I'm sure that, even now, you are beginning to understand how the story of Heshi intertwines with yours. In Chapter 3, you will witness similar stories of people who long for a home that is no longer there, for a glorious Tang that became a ghost, and you, young master of blissful retreat, a home that was burnt down and ripped away from you the same way that Chang'an burned, will finally get the answers you've been looking for. Perhaps that is the lesson of these 3 chapters. Home is not a place. It is the people who wait for you, the soldiers who held the line, the hero who walked east and learned that the dream was not the same as the reality. And sometimes, when the dream ends, when the dynasty falls, when the capital burns, when the world you believed in crumbles to dust, all you have left is the story of a road walked, a home longed for, even when home no longer exists because it was burnt to the ground. The story that, in hindsight, parallels a little too closely with your own story. That is the truth the desert taught. That is the truth the gilded cage taught. That is the truth the ashes of Chang'an will teach you. It is time for the final dream, for reflection, for realization, and for answers you've been seeking all along. For the stories to converge and come full circle, back to the place you are familiar with. So dream on a little longer, young master, and when you wake, I will be there to welcome you back.